Which bunker? Frank Dalton's voice was so quiet that Richard Palmer almost talked over it. The question drifted through the Saturday barbecue beneath the clatter of serving trays, the hiss of burgers on the grill, and the easy laughter of families gathered beneath the Veterans Hall pavilion. For the last 15 minutes, Richard had owned the table. At 76, he was still broad through the shoulders, with silver hair brushed neatly back and a voice practiced at carrying across a crowd. He had been telling 6 people about Khe Sanh, describing cold rain, red earth, sandbags, and nights when sleep came in pieces. Nobody had questioned him. Then Frank spoke. The 82-year-old veteran sat alone at the end of a picnic table, a paper plate cooling in front of him. White hair showed beneath an old baseball cap. His faded denim jacket carried no medals, unit patches, or slogans. He had spent most of the afternoon listening more than talking, his pale blue eyes occasionally following the American flag as the wind moved it above the pavilion. Richard turned toward him. "Excuse me?" Frank lifted his coffee. "You said the power went out in your bunker that night. Which bunker?" A few conversations nearby softened. Richard smiled, not yet bothered. "Command side. Near the main position." Frank took a sip. "Which one?" The smile remained, but Richard's eyes sharpened. "You writing a book, friend?" Someone at the table chuckled. Frank did not. "Just asking." Richard leaned back. "We had names for places that never made it onto official maps. You know how it was." Frank looked at him for a long second. "I do." 2 words. Nothing more. Daniel Foster, a 45-year-old former Marine standing beside a cooler, noticed the exchange and stopped reaching for a bottle of water. He had heard enough veterans tell stories to recognize the difference between curiosity and examination. Frank was not challenging Richard. Not yet. He was listening for something. Richard returned to his audience. "Anyway, we lost the lights, and I remember moving from that bunker toward the command post in pitch darkness. Maybe 200 yards. Felt like 2 miles in that weather." Frank's fork stopped halfway to his plate. Richard noticed this time. "Something wrong?" "No." Frank set the fork down. "Go on." The answer irritated Richard more than disagreement might have. "Were you there?" he asked. Frank's expression did not change. "Were you?" The laughter around the table vanished. Even the grill seemed louder. Richard studied the old man, then gave a short smile. "January through April. 1968. Frank nodded once. "Long stretch." "Long enough." "What company?" Richard hesitated only a fraction. "Different attachments. Things moved around." Daniel caught the hesitation. So did Frank. But Frank did not press. He looked down at his coffee as though the matter no longer interested him. Richard continued, adding details about rainwater collecting near the trenches and the constant damp that settled into clothing. Some of it sounded convincing. Very convincing. Frank listened without interruption until Richard mentioned crossing behind a particular position on his way toward the command area. Then the old veteran's eyes lifted again. Something had changed in them. Not anger. Recognition. "That is interesting," Frank said. Richard folded his arms. "What is?" Frank glanced toward the Veterans Hall, where an old reproduction map of Khe Sanh hung among the historical displays inside. "Nothing yet." Richard followed his gaze. "You think I have something wrong?" Frank looked back at him. "I think memories get old." Richard's smile tightened. "Mine are just fine." Frank nodded toward the building. "Then a map should not bother them." Richard Palmer held Frank Dalton's gaze for a moment, then pushed his chair back from the picnic table. The metal legs scraped across the concrete beneath the pavilion. "Fine," Richard said. "Let us look at your map." His tone remained casual, but the easy warmth that had carried his story through the barbecue was gone. Frank rose more slowly. At 82, he did not move like a man trying to impress anyone. He placed one hand on the table, stood, straightened his faded denim jacket, and picked up his coffee. Daniel Foster followed several steps behind them. So did 3 of the people who had been listening to Richard. Nobody announced that the barbecue had changed. It simply had. Outside, burgers still hissed over the grill. Children still crossed the grass carrying paper cups. But inside the Veterans Hall, the air was cooler and quieter. Framed photographs covered the walls beneath old unit plaques and folded flags. Richard stopped beside the large reproduction map mounted behind glass. "There," he said, pointing toward the northern section. "That is roughly where we were." Frank stood several feet away. "Roughly?" Richard glanced at him. "It was almost 60 years ago." "That is true." Frank stepped closer. His eyes moved across the map without searching. Daniel noticed that immediately. Most people studying an unfamiliar map looked for labels first. Frank did not. His gaze traveled from one position to another as naturally as someone looking across an old neighborhood. Richard tapped the glass. "We moved from here toward the command area after the lights went out." Frank studied the route. "Which way?" "Straight across." "Across what?" Richard frowned. "The open ground between the positions." Frank took another sip of coffee. "At night?" "Yes." "In that weather?" "We did what we had to do." Richard's voice grew firmer. A few people behind Daniel exchanged looks. Frank nodded, apparently satisfied. "And when was this?" "Late January. Maybe the 24th or 25th. Frank's eyes settled on one point along the route Richard had indicated. "Interesting." Richard gave a humorless laugh. "There is that word again." Frank turned toward him. "The path you are describing was not being used that way yet." Silence entered the room. Richard's jaw tightened. "You cannot know that from a tourist map." "No." "Then what are you saying?" Frank looked back at the glass. "I am saying there was drainage work there. Mud deep enough to take a boot if you stepped wrong. Men went around it." Richard responded quickly. "Then I went around it. I am giving you the short version." The answer came smoothly enough that several listeners relaxed. Daniel did not. Frank seemed almost pleased by it. "Fair enough." Richard folded his arms. "Now maybe you answer something. You keep correcting details, but you still have not said whether you were there." Frank's face remained unreadable. "I asked first?" And I answered, "Not really." Richard stepped closer. "January through April. 1968. Khe Sanh." "That is my answer." Frank nodded. "Then you remember the mornings?" Richard paused. "Of course." "What about them?" "Cold. Wet. Miserable." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "That part is true." Richard seized on the words. "Because I lived it." Frank did not challenge him. Instead, he turned toward a nearby display case where an old metal cup, a radio handset, and several photographs rested beneath warm museum lights. For the briefest instant, his attention fixed on the radio. His expression changed so subtly that only Daniel noticed. There was distance in his eyes now, something older than the room around him. Richard followed his gaze. "You recognize that equipment?" Frank looked back at the map. "I recognize a lot of things." Richard gave a short laugh. "Books will do that." Frank finally set his coffee on the display ledge. "Books give you names." His finger rose toward the map, stopping over the cluster of positions Richard had been describing. "They do not always tell you what the men called the places after dark." Richard's smile faded. Frank looked directly at him. "Do you remember those names?" Richard Palmer did not answer immediately. His eyes moved from Frank to the map, then toward the small audience that had followed them inside. The pause lasted barely 2 seconds, but Daniel Foster felt it. Outside, someone lifted the grill lid and a burst of laughter rolled through the open doorway. Inside, nobody laughed. Richard finally shrugged. Every group had nicknames. Half of them changed depending on who was talking. Frank nodded. "That is true." Richard seemed relieved by the agreement. "So asking me to remember some private nickname after all these years does not prove anything." "I did not say it did." Frank's voice remained even. Then what exactly are you trying to prove? Nothing. Frank looked at the reproduction map again. I am trying to remember your route. Richard stepped beside him and pointed through the glass. I already showed you. We started near this position, crossed here, then moved south toward command. Frank followed the line with his eyes. Late January? Yes. At night? Yes. Frank raised one weathered finger and traced the route without touching the glass. He stopped halfway. You would not have gone through there. Richard's expression hardened. We already covered this. No. Before we talked about mud. Frank shifted his finger less than an inch on the map. This is different. Daniel moved closer. What was there? Frank glanced at him. Not what? When? He looked back at Richard. The route changed. Richard gave a dismissive shake of his head. Routes change constantly. Exactly. Frank's pale blue eyes settled on him. Which is why the date matters. The room became quiet enough to hear the ceiling fan turning overhead. Richard pointed at another line. Then we came around this side. Frank studied it. That is possible. Richard smiled. There you go. But that puts you behind the wrong bunker. The smile disappeared. Frank stepped closer to the map. If you came from that direction, you would have passed the water point before reaching command. You said you reached command first? Richard stared at the map. Maybe I told it backward. Maybe. Frank offered the word without judgment. That somehow made it sharper. Richard turned toward the listeners. This is what happens when people treat memories like survey measurements. We were not walking around with maps in our hands. No, Frank said. We usually kept them dry when we could. Daniel looked at him. Usually. Frank had said it naturally, without emphasis. Richard heard it too. So you were there. Frank ignored the question. His gaze remained fixed on the map. What did you call the bunker near the water point? Richard's shoulders tightened. I told you. Different people use different names. Give me yours. After nearly 60 years? You remembered the route. Richard's face reddened slightly. I remember enough. Frank nodded. Then tell me one name. Richard looked around the room, aware now that the audience was no longer admiring him. They were waiting. He pointed toward the display case. You think because you studied some old maps, you can stand here and interrogate me? Frank's expression did not move. No. Then stop acting like you own the place. Frank glanced toward the photographs on the wall, then back at Richard. Nobody owns a memory like that. For the first time, something uncertain appeared behind Richard's eyes. Daniel saw it, and stepped closer to the map. Mr. Palmer, you said you were there from January through April. Surely one local name would stick. Richard looked at him sharply. And who are you? Just someone listening. Richard exhaled and turned back to Frank. All right, old-timer. You seem to know everything. You tell them. Frank was silent. He looked at the map for several long seconds, his eyes moving across positions whose printed labels seemed to mean less to him than the spaces between them. Then he raised one finger. That one, he said quietly. We called the icebox. His finger moved. That was Chapel Hole. Another position. Red Door. Then one farther south. Murphy's Corner. Richard's face changed. Frank's finger stopped over a small position near the route they had been arguing about. He looked directly at Richard. And this one had a name too. Richard swallowed. Frank lowered his hand. But if you were there, I should not have to tell you. Richard stared at the unnamed position beneath Frank's finger, but no answer came. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, pushing cool air through the veterans' hall while the sounds of the barbecue continued outside. Frank did not press him. Instead, he lowered his hand and studied the map again. The printed lines began to lose their sharpness before his eyes. For an instant, the glass reflected an 82-year-old man in a faded denim jacket. Then memory replaced him with someone 22 years old. The room disappeared. Cold mist settled over red earth. Frank could smell wet canvas, damp timber, coffee that had been sitting too long in a metal cup. Radio static whispered from somewhere behind him. Boots moved carefully along narrow paths softened by days of rain. Nothing looked like the clean reproduction map hanging in the Veterans Hall. The place had been uneven, muddy, crowded with sandbags, timber walls, supply boxes, handwritten markers, and men inventing names because official designations felt too distant from daily life. The icebox had earned its name because cold air seemed to settle there before sunrise. Chapel Hole had been named after a young Marine who kept a small pocket Bible beside his coffee cup. Red Door was not red at all. Someone had painted a scrap of wood with leftover marking paint, and the name survived after the paint faded. Murphy's Corner belonged to no map. It was simply where a man named Murphy always seemed to be standing when somebody needed directions. Frank remembered all of them. Not as coordinates. As places where voices lived. He saw himself moving through the morning haze with a folded message protected beneath his jacket. A radio operator called after him. "Dalton!" Frank turned. The young man's face was clear even after all these years. Michael Palmer stood near the entrance to a low timber position, holding a metal cup and complaining that the coffee had gone cold again. Frank almost smiled at the memory. Michael always complained about the coffee, then drank every drop. "You heading toward the water point?" Michael asked. Frank nodded. Michael pointed down the trench. "Take the long way past Murphy's Corner. Short path is nothing but mud." Frank remembered answering that he already knew. Michael laughed. "Everybody knows until they lose a boot." The memory shifted with the mist. A deck of cards rested on an ammunition box used as a table. Michael shuffled them badly. One card was missing. It had been missing for weeks. Nobody remembered which man had lost it, but Michael refused to replace the deck. He claimed a complete deck would ruin its luck. Frank remembered the ridiculous argument better than some official dates. That was the cruelty and mercy of memory. History preserved operations. Men remembered cold coffee and missing cards. "Frank?" Daniel's voice pulled him back. The Veterans Hall returned around him. His finger was still resting near the glass. Richard was watching him differently now. Frank blinked once and lowered his hand. "You all right?" Daniel asked. "Fine." Richard cleared his throat. "Those names could have come from anywhere." Frank looked at him. "Could have. Old letters. Other veterans. Somebody's memoir. Could have." Richard's confidence returned slightly. "Then none of this proves you were there either." Frank nodded. "That is fair." The answer surprised everyone. Richard stepped closer to the map. "So what is this? Two old men arguing about whose memory is better?" Frank looked at the unnamed position again. "No." His voice softened. "Memory is exactly why I am being careful." Richard folded his arms. "Then name that last bunker." Frank remained silent for several seconds. He could still hear Michael complaining about coffee through the distance of decades. Finally, Frank looked directly at Richard. "Before I name it, you should." Richard's jaw tightened. "Why?" Frank's pale eyes held his. "Because the man who gave it that name had your last name." Richard Palmer's face changed before he could hide it. It was not recognition alone. It was the sudden fear of hearing a private door unlock in a room full of strangers. Frank Dalton saw it, and knew he had touched the right memory. Daniel Foster saw it too. "My last name?" Richard asked. His voice had lost some of its confidence. Frank nodded toward the map. "Palmer." Richard gave a thin smile. "There were plenty of Palmers in the service." "There were." Frank let the silence stretch. "But only one I remember carrying a deck of cards with one missing." Richard stopped breathing for a beat. Outside, metal tongs struck the edge of the grill. A child laughed near the pavilion. Inside, every face remained turned toward the two old men. Frank continued quietly. "He kept that deck in a green canvas pouch. Said replacing it would ruin the luck." Richard's arms slowly unfolded. Where did you hear that? Frank did not answer. He pointed toward the small position on the map. The men had a name for this place. It was not printed on anything official. It came from a joke one morning when the coffee had gone cold again. Richard stared at the spot. His lips parted, but nothing came out. Frank waited. What did you call it? Richard asked. I asked you first. The challenge was gentle, almost reluctant. Richard looked toward the people behind him as though searching for an escape from their attention. I do not remember every nickname. Then tell me who named it. Richard swallowed. How should I remember that after nearly 60 years? Frank's expression softened, and that softness made the moment heavier. Some names get harder to forget. Daniel stepped closer. He no longer saw this as two veterans comparing memories. Something personal was unfolding. Richard looked back at Frank. You are trying to embarrass me. No. Then what do you want? Frank's gaze moved to the display case. Beneath the museum lights rested several photographs donated by local military families. One showed young servicemen gathered around a rough table, their faces softened by age and graying. Frank walked toward it. His steps were slow but certain. He bent slightly toward the glass. There, near the far edge of the photograph, stood a young man with dark hair, a metal cup in one hand and the beginning of a grin on his face. Frank stared at him for several seconds. Michael Palmer, he said. Richard went completely still. Daniel looked at Richard, then at the photograph. Michael? Frank asked without turning. Your brother? Richard's answer came quietly. Yes. The single word changed everything. Frank straightened and faced him. There was no triumph in his eyes. Only an old sadness. Michael hated cold coffee. Richard's face had gone pale. He told you that? He told everyone. Frank almost smiled. Every morning. Richard looked at the photograph again. You knew him? Frank nodded once. I did. How well? Frank returned to the map and pointed toward the unnamed position. Well enough to know he called this place the card table, because that was where he kept trying to finish games with a deck that could not be finished. Richard closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the confidence that had filled the barbecue was gone. Frank watched him carefully. That name was never on a map, Richard. Richard said nothing. It was never in a history book. Still nothing. Frank's voice lowered. And Michael never called it that in the letters he sent home. Richard's eyes snapped toward him. That reaction told Frank more than any confession could have. Daniel understood it a second later. Richard knew the letters. Frank stepped away from the map. So I am going to ask you one more time. His pale blue eyes held Richard's. When you tell these people you were at Khe Sanh, whose memories are you actually telling? Richard did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph in the display case, on the younger brother preserved behind glass with a metal cup in one hand and that familiar half-smile on his face. The room waited. Frank did not repeat the question. He had learned long ago that silence could carry more weight than accusation. Finally, Richard lowered his head. Michael's, he said. The word barely carried beyond the display case. Daniel Foster shifted his stance, but Frank remained still. Most of them were Michael's. Richard rubbed one hand across his face. He came home with boxes. Letters. Maps. Notebooks. Photographs. He almost never talked about any of it. Frank looked toward Michael's picture. That sounds like him. Richard gave a small, bitter laugh. You knew him for a few months. I knew him my whole life, and somehow there was an entire part of him I could never reach. Frank's expression softened. Some men brought places home without bringing the words with them. Richard nodded slowly. After he died, I found everything in his attic. I started reading. At first, I just wanted to understand him. His gaze returned to the map. There were dates in the notebooks. Weather. Names. Little details. The coffee. The cards. The mud. Things he never told us at dinner. Frank said nothing. Richard continued. A few years later, somebody at a veterans fundraiser asked about him. I told one of his stories. I said my brother was at Khe Sanh. He paused. People listened. Really listened. Outside, the barbecue continued beneath the afternoon sun, but the veterans' hall seemed separated from it by decades. Then another time. Richard said. I said we had family at Khe Sanh. After that, it became we were there. He looked at Frank. Shame had replaced defensiveness. Eventually I stopped correcting people when they thought I meant me. Daniel's voice was quiet. And today? Richard closed his eyes briefly. Today I said I was there. Frank walked back toward the map. Why? Richard stared at his brother's photograph. Because when I said Michael's name, people were polite. When I told the story like it happened to me, they leaned closer. The admission landed harder than any argument could have. Frank rested one hand against the wooden edge beneath the map. So you borrowed his place in the story? Richard looked down. Yes. Frank's eyes traveled across the printed positions. Then let us see how much of Michael you actually remember. Richard looked up. Frank pointed toward the small position they had called the card table. What did he write about mornings there? Richard hesitated. Cold coffee. That was every morning. Frank moved his finger east. What sound did he mention before sunrise? Richard searched his memory. A generator? Frank shook his head. Not there. Richard's breathing became shallow. Radio checks? Later. Frank waited. Richard could not answer. A loose sheet of corrugated metal, Frank said. The wind caught one corner before sunrise. Tap. Pause. Tap. Pause. Michael complained about it for days. Richard stared at him. Frank moved to another point. Who kept telling Michael to replace that missing card? Silence. What did Michael call the water point when the ground turned bad? Silence again. Frank lowered his hand. There was no satisfaction in his face. Books remember dates. Letters remember what a man chose to write home. But being there leaves you with useless little things nobody thinks history will need. Richard's eyes glistened, but his voice remained steady. You really were with him? Frank nodded. Yes. And that bunker name? Frank looked once more at the card table. Michael named it. Richard swallowed. Frank turned toward him. Your brother earned those memories, Richard. You do not need to stand inside them for people to remember his name. Richard stood quietly beside the display case, his brother's younger face reflected faintly across the glass. For several seconds, he seemed to forget the people around him. Frank understood that look. He had seen it in veterans' halls, at reunions, beside old photographs passed carefully from hand to hand. It was the expression of someone discovering that memory had preserved a person differently than grief had. Tell me about him, Richard finally said. Frank glanced toward Michael's photograph. What do you want to know? Richard gave a helpless shrug. Something that was not in the notebooks. Frank considered the request. Then the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Your brother was terrible at shuffling cards. Richard blinked. Daniel Foster almost smiled. Frank continued. He would bend half the deck, lose control of the other half, then blame the humidity. Every time. Richard stared at him. He did that at home. Then he never improved. A small laugh escaped Richard before he could stop it. It lasted only a second, but it changed the room. Frank pointed toward Michael's metal cup in the photograph. He carried that thing everywhere. Complained about cold coffee, but if somebody offered to make fresh coffee, he said the old stuff was fine. Richard nodded slowly. My mother used to say he could complain about anything and still refuse to change it. Your mother knew him well. Frank's eyes remained on the photograph. Michael also wrote letters on Sunday mornings. Always Sunday. He would sit near the entrance where there was enough light and spend 20 minutes staring at the first line. Richard's face tightened with emotion. We got those letters on Thursdays. Frank looked at him. He talked about home more than he probably wrote about it. What did he say? Mostly ordinary things. Asked whether your father's truck was still making that knocking sound. Wondered whether the maple behind your house had survived the winter. Once he spent 10 minutes arguing that you still owed him $5. Richard's eyes widened. For a baseball game. Frank nodded. That was it. Richard looked down and laughed softly through the emotion in his voice. He never forgot that $5. He mentioned it often enough that none of us forgot it either. The people behind them were no longer watching a confrontation. They were listening to a man return someone else's brother piece by piece. Frank stepped toward another photograph in the display, scanning the young faces. Michael was not the loudest man there. He did not tell people what he had done unless somebody asked. Mostly he remembered little things for everyone else. Daniel looked at Richard. That sounds different from the stories outside. Richard nodded. Because I made them bigger. Frank turned toward him. History does that enough on its own. Richard looked at the floor. I thought bigger meant people would care. People care about people. Frank tapped one finger lightly against the wooden frame beneath Michael's photograph. Cold coffee. Bad card games. $5. A tree back home. That is the man worth remembering. Richard swallowed. Did he ever talk about me? Frank answered immediately. Yes. Richard looked up. What did he say? Frank's expression softened. He said his little brother could talk his way into any room in America. Daniel glanced at Richard, and this time several people smiled. Richard did too, though his eyes remained wet. That sounds like Michael. There was more. Frank paused. He said he hoped you would never have to borrow somebody else's life to feel like yours mattered. Richard's smile disappeared. The words settled between them without cruelty. Frank had not spoken them as punishment. Richard looked again at his brother behind the glass. For the first time that afternoon, he seemed ready to hear the difference between honoring a memory and becoming trapped inside it. He took a slow breath. I need to go back outside. Frank nodded. Richard looked toward the pavilion where the people who had believed his story were still gathered. I need to tell it again. Frank picked up his coffee from the display ledge. Then start with his name. Richard Palmer stepped through the open doorway and back beneath the pavilion, where the smell of charcoal and grilled onions still hung in the warm afternoon air. Conversation softened as people noticed him returning with Frank Dalton and Daniel Foster several steps behind. Richard stopped beside the same picnic table where, less than an hour earlier, he had spoken with effortless confidence. His paper cup still sat near the edge. Nobody had moved it. He looked at the faces around him and seemed suddenly older than 76. I need to correct something, he said. The nearest conversation stopped completely. Frank remained near the doorway, giving Richard the space to do what had to be done. Richard placed both hands on the back of an empty chair. I told you I was at Khe Sanh in 1968. He paused. I was not. No one interrupted. A breeze moved through the pavilion, stirring the small American flags placed along the tables. Richard looked toward the Veterans Hall behind him. My brother was. His name was Michael Palmer. The name came out carefully, almost as if Richard were returning something fragile to its proper owner. After Michael died, I found his letters, notebooks, maps, and photographs. I read them for years. I learned his dates. I learned the places he wrote about. I learned enough details that eventually I could tell his stories without looking at the pages. Richard lowered his eyes. At first, I always said they were his stories. Then I started saying our family had been there. Later, I let people think I had been there too. He drew a slow breath. Today I stopped letting them think it. I claimed it. Daniel watched the listeners. There was disappointment on several faces, but no one mocked Richard. Frank had been right about silence. Sometimes it left nowhere for excuses to hide. Richard continued. I told myself I was keeping Michael alive. The truth is, I liked how people listened when they thought the memories belonged to me. He looked toward Frank. Then this man asked me about a bunker. A few heads turned toward the old veteran. Frank remained still, coffee in one hand, faded denim jacket open in the afternoon warmth. Richard shook his head. I knew the map. I knew the dates. I knew what Michael had written. But I did not know the names the men used among themselves. I did not know about the loose sheet of metal before sunrise. I did not know who complained about the coffee or why a deck of cards was missing one card. His voice softened. He did. Richard nodded toward Frank. Because he knew my brother there. Frank looked down at his coffee rather than accept the attention. Richard reached into his wallet and removed a small, worn photograph. He had carried it for years. Michael stood beside a family car, younger than Richard had ever allowed himself to remember him. Richard placed the photograph on the picnic table. This is Michael Palmer. He was my older brother. He was at Khe Sanh. I was not. The correction was simple. That made it powerful. Frank walked forward at last and stopped beside the table. He looked at the photograph and smiled faintly. That is more like the Michael I remember. Richard glanced at him. You really remember all those little things? Frank nodded. More of them than the important things. Richard gave a quiet laugh. He really complained about coffee that much? Every morning. And the $5? Constantly. Richard shook his head, and for the first time the shame in his face made room for affection. Frank pulled out the empty chair beside him. Sit down. Richard looked surprised. After what I did? Frank rested one hand on the chair back. You told the truth. Now tell us about your brother. Richard sat. Frank took the chair beside him. Around them, people slowly gathered closer again, but this time Richard did not begin with weather, maps, or borrowed memories. He picked up Michael's photograph and held it carefully between both hands. My brother's name was Michael Palmer, he said, and this story belongs to him. Richard Palmer began again, but this time there was no performance in his voice. He told them about Michael as a brother before he ever mentioned him as a Marine. He talked about two boys growing up in a small Ohio town, sharing a bedroom until Richard was 14, arguing over baseball, borrowing each other's clothes without permission, and competing for the front seat whenever their father drove into town. The people around the picnic table listened differently now. Nobody leaned closer for spectacle. They listened because Michael Palmer had finally become a person instead of a borrowed war story. Frank Dalton sat beside Richard with his coffee cooling between both hands. Occasionally, he added something Richard had never known. Michael could never whistle properly. He wrote slowly because he hated crossing out words. He saved sugar packets even when nobody needed them. Before sunrise, when the air was coldest, he would stand near the entrance with that battered metal cup and stare toward the first gray light as if morning itself were something worth waiting for. Richard smiled at that. He did the same thing at home, he said. After he came back, he would stand on the porch before anybody else was awake. Frank nodded. Some habits know the way home. Daniel Foster quietly went inside and returned carrying the framed photograph from the display. He placed it on the table beside Richard's smaller family picture. Frank studied the young faces again. His finger stopped over Michael. There. Richard leaned closer. That is him. For once, the statement contained no claim beyond the truth. Frank began naming the others in the photograph. Not ranks first. Names. Men he remembered by voices, habits, jokes, and ordinary moments that official records could never preserve. When he finished, Richard looked at him. And which one is you? Frank hesitated, then pointed toward a thin young man near the edge of the group. Richard stared at the photograph, then at the 82-year-old beside him. The pale blue eyes were the same. You never told anyone outside that you were there, Richard said. Frank shrugged. People who needed to know already knew. Then why stop me today? Frank looked across the pavilion. Afternoon sunlight had softened across the grass. Smoke from the grill drifted upward and disappeared into the warm air. Because Michael cannot correct the story himself. Richard lowered his gaze. Frank continued without anger. A man's memory belongs to everyone who loved him, but his life still belongs to him. There is a difference. Richard nodded slowly. I crossed it. Yes. Frank did not soften the truth, but neither did he sharpen it. And then you crossed back. Richard looked at Michael's photograph. I wish I had asked him more while he was alive. Frank took a slow breath. Most of us do. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Richard reached for the framed photograph and turned it so the people gathered around the table could see Michael clearly. I want to donate copies of his letters and photographs to the hall, he said. Under his name. Daniel nodded. We can help with that. Richard looked at Frank. And if I tell his stories again? Frank's expression carried the faintest smile. Start the same way you did this time. Richard looked down at his brother's face. My brother's name was Michael Palmer. Frank nodded. That is a good beginning. The barbecue slowly returned to life around them. Plates moved. Coffee was poured. Conversations resumed. But Michael's photograph remained at the center of the table, no longer hidden behind another man's claim. As the sun dropped lower, Frank rose to leave. Richard stood with him. No salute passed between them. No applause followed. Richard simply offered his hand. Frank took it. Thank you for remembering him, Richard said. Frank looked once more at the photograph. Thank him by remembering him truthfully. Then he walked toward the parking lot beneath the long evening light, leaving Richard beside the brother whose story had finally been returned to its rightful name. Memory becomes honor only when we tell it truthfully.